Think about the last time you felt genuinely threatened by someone else's success. Not inspired, not motivated, threatened. There was something about their achievement that felt like an accusation, like their winning somehow made your not winning more real. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, something in you moved to explain it away. Maybe they got lucky. Maybe they had advantages you didn't. Maybe if you look closely enough, what they built isn't actually that impressive. You probably didn't call it what it was. Nobody does. Friedrich Nietzsche called it ressentiment. And in 1887, he described the full psychological architecture of what you just felt, with more precision than most clinical frameworks that came a century later. There's a type of person most of us have met. They're not violent. They don't explode. They don't confront. What they do is watch. They observe people who succeed, who take risks, who want things openly, and something hardens in them. Not quite anger, not quite envy, something quieter and more corrosive than both. They start talking about how those successful people are probably frauds, how ambition is vulgar, how wanting things is embarrassing, how really, if you think about it, not wanting too much is a sign of depth and maturity. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about this exact person in 1887. He called what they felt ressentiment. He borrowed the French word deliberately. There was no German equivalent precise enough for what he was describing. And what he described wasn't just a philosophical concept. It was a psychological mechanism, a specific pattern of how certain people process impotence, failure, and the pain of comparison. The clinical psychology field wouldn't have the vocabulary to fully name what he was pointing at for another several decades. Some of it is still being worked out. Nietzsche was not a psychologist. He had no laboratory, no patients, no controlled studies. What he had was an uncomfortable ability to observe people without flinching and a refusal to accept flattering explanations for human behavior. His central argument On the Genealogy of Morality was that morality itself had a history, that what people called good and evil hadn't always meant what it meant in 19th century Europe, that those meanings had been constructed, and constructed specifically by people who had lost. The weak, the dominated, the powerless. What do they do with that powerlessness? Nietzsche's answer: they transform it. They can't act, so they react. They can't win, so they redefine winning as bad. They can't take, so they decide wanting is shameful. This is ressentiment, not the frustration of someone who fights and loses. The festering of someone who never fights at all and builds an entire inner world to justify the not fighting. The mechanism works like this. Someone with ressentiment is blocked, maybe by circumstance, maybe by fear, maybe by genuine inability. The point is that direct action toward what they want feels impossible, so the energy that would go into action has nowhere to go. In a healthy emotional system, that frustration either motivates change or gets processed and released. But ressentiment doesn't process. It stockpiles, and then it does something specific. It redirects. The person who can't act doesn't sit with the pain of their own limitation. They look outward. They find someone who can act, who does want things, who does pursue, who does succeed. And they make that person the problem. The external target becomes the cause of their suffering, not their own paralysis, not their own fear. The person who dared to try. This is where it gets psychologically precise. Nietzsche observed that ressentiment requires an enemy. It defines itself against something. The person consumed by it needs someone to blame, someone to diminish, someone whose success must be explained away as corruption or luck or moral failure. Without that enemy, the whole structure collapses, and what's left is the unbearable reality of their own inaction. What's remarkable is how accurately this maps onto what clinical psychology later identified as distinct phenomena. In the 1950s and 60s, research into what would eventually be called narcissistic injury described a very similar pattern. When people with fragile self-esteem encounter someone who threatens their sense of superiority through achievement, through genuine confidence, through simply being better at something, the response isn't simply envy. It's a particular kind of rage directed at bringing the threatening person down. The structure is nearly identical to what Nietzsche described: blocked self-assertion, external target, moral inversion. The person who achieved something must be revealed as bad, as undeserving, as having cheated somehow. Psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years studying what he called ego threat and its behavioral consequences. His finding, consistent across multiple studies, was that threatened egotism, not low self-esteem, but unstable self-esteem, the kind that needs constant external validation, was one of the strongest predictors of aggression and hostile behavior, not toward the person's own failures, toward the people who seemed to expose them. Nietzsche, working from observation alone, had located the same mechanism a century earlier. There's a concept in contemporary psychology called malicious envy. Researchers distinguish it from benign envy, the kind that motivates. Benign envy looks at someone else's success and thinks, "I want that too. How do I get there?" It's uncomfortable but productive. Malicious envy looks at someone else's success and thinks, "That should be taken away from them." Not, "I want to rise," but "they should fall." A 2011 study by Niels van der Ven and colleagues at Tilburg University examined this distinction directly. They found that malicious envy activated a specific desire to harm or diminish the envied person, not as a side effect, but as the primary response. The goal wasn't to improve one's own position, it was to destroy the comparison point. This is the behavioral fingerprint of ressentiment. The person consumed by it isn't trying to become better. They're trying to make better not exist, to flatten the landscape so no one stands taller. Nietzsche saw this and understood something that took academic psychology much longer to formally acknowledge: that this isn't a secondary symptom of frustration. It's a primary orientation toward the world, a way of organizing one's entire relationship to other people, to success, to value itself. He also noticed something about what ressentiment does to morality. This is the part that made him genuinely controversial and still does. His argument was that ressentiment had historically been one of the engines of moral systems, that groups who lacked power, who couldn't fight, couldn't compete, couldn't win, had, over centuries, developed philosophies that reframed their weakness as virtue and their opponent's strength as sin. He wasn't celebrating the powerful and condemning the weak. His point was more uncomfortable than that. He was saying, pay attention to the psychological origin of your values. When you call something evil, ask yourself whether you're reacting to a genuine harm, or whether you're reacting to something that threatens you, that you can't match, that you've decided to call evil because that's easier than admitting you want it and can't have it. The question isn't just historically interesting, it comes up in ordinary life constantly. Think about how often moral condemnation arrives exactly where someone is most blocked. The person who repeatedly failed at business tends to have the strongest theories about why ambition is corrupt. The person who gave up on creative work has the most developed opinions about why successful artists sold out. The critique isn't always wrong. Sometimes the morality is genuine. Sometimes the successful person really is a fraud. But Nietzsche's point was, you can't trust your own moral intuitions when they arrive too conveniently, when they consistently target people who have what you couldn't get, when they make your own failure retroactively noble, that's not morality. That's ressentiment dressed as principle. There's a reason this pattern is hard to see in yourself. It doesn't feel like resentment. It feels like clarity. The person in its grip believes they're simply seeing through illusions that others can't. They're the one who knows the successful person is overrated. They're the one who understands that conventional ambition is hollow. They have the sophisticated view that recognizes what everyone else is too naive to question. This is what Nietzsche meant when he described ressentiment as a creative force, creative in the worst sense. It constructs an elaborate fictional world in which the person's failures are actually wisdom, their paralysis is actually discernment, and their hostility toward the successful is actually moral courage. That construction feels, from the inside, like depth. From the outside, there are signs, the excessive investment in the failures of others, the relief that shows up when someone successful turns out to have flaws, the resistance to any evidence that effort actually works. The pattern where every successful person is explained away and every explanation lands in the same direction. Clinical psychologist Leon Seltzer described what he calls sour grapes rationalization, the psychological tendency to devalue what you can't have not before you failed to get it, but specifically because you failed to get it. The devaluation arrives after the loss, then gets presented as if it were the original position. I never really wanted that anyway. The tell is the timing. Nietzsche's prescription, to the extent he had one, wasn't therapy in any conventional sense. He didn't offer steps. What he offered was a challenge. Stop examining other people's motives and start examining the origins of your own. When you feel contempt, ask what it's protecting. When you feel that someone's success is somehow an affront, ask what you're actually reacting to. When your moral convictions land suspiciously close to your personal failures, stop. He called this part of what he meant by self-overcoming, not transcendence, not self-improvement in the modern productivity sense. The harder, slower work of catching yourself in the act of constructing comfortable stories and refusing to let them stand. The person free of ressentiment, in his view, wasn't someone who had no desires or no wounds. It was someone who could be injured without converting that injury into a worldview, who could be blocked without deciding that the thing they were blocked from was secretly worthless, who could want something, fail to get it, and remain honest about both the wanting and the failing. One more thing worth saying, because it doesn't get said enough. Recognizing ressentiment in yourself is not the same as blaming yourself for it. The conditions that produce it are real. Blocked opportunity is real. Unfair disadvantage is real. Watching people with fewer skills and more connections advance while you don't, that's a genuine experience that produces genuine pain. Nietzsche wasn't arguing that the blocked person is simply weak or defective. He was arguing that there are two possible responses to that pain, and they lead to very different places. One is the harder path. Feel the pain directly, assess the situation honestly, decide what can be changed, and act on it. Accept what can't be changed without converting it into a doctrine. Stay in contact with what you actually want, rather than building a philosophy around not having it. The other path is easier in the short term. Externalize the cause. Find the enemy. Build the moral framework that makes your current position the correct one. Let the wound become an identity. Psychologist Albert Bandura's research on what he called self-efficacy, a person's belief in their own capacity to act and produce outcomes, maps directly onto this fork. People with high self-efficacy respond to failure by increasing effort or changing strategy. People with low self-efficacy respond by withdrawing, by attributing outcomes to external forces, by avoiding the situations that might expose them to further failure. Ressentiment is, among other things, a self-efficacy problem. And like most self-efficacy problems, it tends to confirm itself. The less you act, the less evidence you have that action works. The less evidence you have that action works, the more reasonable it seems to explain inaction as wisdom. The cycle closes, and inside it, everything feels coherent. That's what made Nietzsche's observation so uncomfortable then, and still does now. He wasn't describing villains. He was describing a very ordinary human response to very ordinary human pain, and showing how that response, if left unexamined, becomes a permanent way of being in the world. The person it produces isn't visibly broken. They can be intelligent, articulate, perceptive about other people's flaws. They can seem cynical in a way that reads as sophisticated. They can build communities of people who share their framework and validate their vision of the world. What they can't do is want something and go after it without destroying themselves from the inside. That was his concern. Not morality in the abstract, not philosophy for its own sake. The actual practical question of what kind of person a human being is capable of becoming and what gets in the way. He thought ressentiment was one of the most powerful obstacles, and 140 years of psychology coming at the question from entirely different directions has done nothing to suggest he was wrong. That's what's striking looking at this now. It's that the psychological literature has largely confirmed the core structure of what he described, while the popular culture has mostly ignored it in favor of the surface-level story about resentment as simple bitterness. There's also a social dimension to this that Nietzsche noticed, and that contemporary social psychology has since documented extensively. Ressentiment doesn't stay private, it spreads. One of its functions is coalition building. The person carrying it finds others who share the wound, who've been equally blocked, who have the same convenient enemies, and together they construct a shared moral framework in which their collective impotence is reframed as collective virtue. This is visible in almost every ideological movement, across the political spectrum, across history, across cultures. The language varies, the emotional logic doesn't. Groups that have lost or fear losing or have been genuinely harmed often develop moral systems that elevate their position, not by improving it, but by delegitimizing whoever sits above them. Nietzsche's point wasn't that the grievances are always false. Sometimes they're entirely legitimate. People are genuinely harmed. Power is genuinely abused. The world is not fair. His point was narrower and harder. The feeling of injustice and the reality of injustice are not the same thing. Ressentiment produces the feeling whether the injustice is real or not. And once that feeling is running the analysis, it tends to find what it's looking for. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's work on moral intuition documented something similar. People typically experience a moral judgment first. Something feels wrong, and then construct reasoning to support it after the fact. The reasoning feels like the cause. It's usually the justification. Nietzsche made this observation in 1887. He would have recognized Haidt's findings immediately. What Nietzsche identified was something more precise and more difficult. Not the emotion itself, but the function it serves. The way it protects a fragile self from having to confront its own limitations by permanently externalizing blame. The way it disguises itself as wisdom, as morality, as superior perception. The modern concepts, narcissistic injury, malicious envy, ego threat, sour grapes rationalization, are refinements of his original observation, more testable, more specific. But the underlying architecture is the same. A man working in the 19th century with no access to controlled studies or neuroimaging or clinical data looked closely enough at how people actually behaved, not how they explained themselves, but how they behaved, and mapped a pattern that held. That's not philosophy in the abstract sense. That's something closer to what we'd now call psychological observation, and it's been sitting in his work this whole time, waiting for the field to catch up. If you stayed until here, you'll want the next one. Subscribe. The next one goes further.